what got you here?
So actually, funny enough, was graduating with my bachelor's degree in psychology, and I was a young professional, and I thought teens is going to be really the most impactful place to start. And then having, grown up around recovery, it was just really natural for me.
Awesome. Yeah. Teens. I worked in a middle school at one point, and one of my favorite experiences was this young girl who came in. She was in about the 8th grade, and you could tell this was a public school. It was a small public school, and you knew pretty immediately who ran the school. Okay. And she was one of those girls who ran the school, not because she was pro-social, not because she got good grades, but because she was a powerhouse. And maybe a mean girl. I wasn't quite sure at that moment. I just watched her in the hall. So she came into my office and started talking to me about her life and her aspirations and wanting to be a marine biologist and how her parents were educated and all of these things. Turns out none of it was true. Not one word of it was true. And I remember having her come in the office a couple of weeks later, and I said, "Hey, why'd you lie to me?" And she laughed. She said, "I lie to everybody. Why wouldn't I lie to you?"
Yeah, and that's so much of it, right? Digging through, and the facade, especially the teens feel like they need to put on in order to be socially accepted, or to have some level of control or power in those situations.
Yes. So when you're working with a huge range of ages right now, Erin, from 14 to what, 70s?
Yep. The whole continuum of care there.
Wow. So how do you, in your mind, break out care that's different in those teen years than in the middle years? Because I would imagine that the geriatric years are also have their own specialty as well. So talk to me about the strategies with teens.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, and really working with the clinical teams and even the families, is keeping in mind that these are teenagers, that they're going to make impulsive decisions, that they're going to make decisions and say things to us that to them sounds totally rational. But as an adult now, I'm sitting here like, this makes no sense. But if we really take a step back, teenagers are in that stage of their brain is developing, their social norms are developing, they're individuating. And so I think if we can look at these teenagers as really in this process of discovering who they are, and not to let them off the hook, let me be clear about that, but to be able to take a step back and almost view things the way that they do. Where they're going to view sometimes like the clinical team as their parents who are trying to control them. And what's interesting is geriatrics have the same experience, right? Like the people are trying to control me. I don't have any control. I have no power. So the similarities are really interesting.
I can see that. Absolutely. Ooh, something's on with my speaker. So I can understand where the geriatric population and the teenage population, then I start thinking about the baby boomer population who's given birth to your younger patients and is been raised by your older ones. They must feel so sandwiched in the middle.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of our parents are desperate, right? Like if you started off, you having teenagers, there's this sense of desperation that these parents experience, that they just want their kids to be healthy and they're willing to do whatever it takes to get there. But they feel sandwiched between what maybe other parents are experiencing with their kids and how that might be different from what they're experiencing with their own kids, and just the pressures. So certainly with the teens, having a lot of family work involved with them.
Yeah, I don't think we treat teens without the families, really, are we?
No, and that's one of the interesting things is, there are times, and it doesn't happen super often, but I think acknowledging that there are really times when the teenage patient comes in with more awareness of their behavioral health or substance use concerns than their family does. And I'll tell you where I see it more often is with the girls. I've worked with both the boys and the girls, and parents of boys are much more likely to put them in a rehab. But parents of girls, I would say at least 90% of our female teen patients that come in have been to a psychiatric facility prior to coming to Caron. and they're much more focused on mental health concerns and substance use with the girls.
How much of that is a sexual trauma for the girls? I'm not saying that doesn't happen for boys, but in my experience, I've noticed significant history of a trauma sexually for the girls coming into programs.
Yeah, and I think also, you have the trauma piece, and then you also have, again, like you said, not that it doesn't happen with boys, but a good number of our girls have been sexually assaulted as 14, 15, 16, and then there's this whole other layer that comes along with it, where they have their own shame. I was under the influence, or I shouldn't have been in that situation. And sometimes their families, I remember working with a teenage girl whose family said to her, had you not been using and you hadn't been in that situation, this never would have happened. And so, right away they're invalidated and their experience isn't heard. And so they come in thinking that we're going to approach them the same way, that we're going to have some judgment around it. And so it's a lot of trust building and rapport building. People either love to work with teens or they hate it.
Yeah. I think I'm clearly a teenager, so I love working with teens. I get them. I really do. I get the rebellion. I get that not every bit of their angst and aggression is actually symptomatic, that maybe their vision is clearer than mine.
Yes. Yeah, and I'm so glad you bring that up, because I think that, one of the things I've seen happen with our teens is they'll come in and their normal teen behavior has been pathologized in a way that they have heavy diagnoses that are going to follow them. And, when we sit down with them, either it's trauma related, right? They've been diagnosed with some really serious mental health concern, and it's really a trauma response, or it's like normal teenage behavior.
Right. I remember asking my son when he was, I don't know, mid-teens, I said, do you lie to me? And he said, yeah, I'm a teenager. And I was like, right. I had to walk away going, right. I lied to my parents. I'm not saying there aren't kids out there that are honest 100% with their parents, but I don't know them.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't grow up with them.
Yeah. And I think that, that becomes one of the challenges when, a teen comes into therapy, is the parents are already approaching it where they lie about everything. And, they can't be believed, and they're manipulative and all these things. And some of it is related to substance use or behavioral health, right? Like they're doing those things to protect their substance use. Correct. But on the other side of it is, some of that is developmental, and they have to learn to have consequences as a result of that sometimes, and sometimes they don't. But really helping the families to understand that some of these behaviors that might be related to a substance use or behavioral health concern are also normal teen behaviors.
And maybe beyond normal teen behaviors, typical of their family behaviors. If mom and dad are on the phone and they're telling white lies all the time, and their teenager is listening to those particular, misspeaks, how do we explain the difference between that and what we are doing, what we're coming down on?
Yeah. And I think that that's also one of the important pieces, that the family involvement is so important. We've had, and especially I think with the pandemic, actually, we've had more teen patients coming in saying, well, I'm stealing my pot from my dad. I'm not getting it from the kid at school. I'm taking liquor out of the liquor cabinet, especially because the kids have been isolated, have not been to school. And so I think that one of the interesting shifts has been where parents were historically kind of blaming the peer group for some of these behaviors. Now, we're having patients coming in saying, well, I'm taking it from dad and mom. And so having to go back to the family and say, well, this is, kind of what we're hearing, and really having that difficult dialogue also.
And then we have to have the dialogue of what is really okay in your home. What do you value? What behavior do you want seen? Because you might have to change what you're modeling.
Mhm.
That's a really
Yeah.
difficult conversation.
Yeah, and that's where, certain, go ahead.
No, how do you explain? I work with parents of teenagers all the time, but how do you explain to parents about their own use? How do you talk to them about it? I'd love to
Yeah,
know.
I mean, I think one of the things that we, just as you said, is we're talking with these families that you're really modeling what's acceptable, in your home. And, we know the research tells us that if there are substances, if that's part of the social norm in the house, there's a higher propensity towards substance use, right? And being able to have parents model what's appropriate behavior. And for a lot of our families, we're asking them, look, take the substances out of the home. And some families are willing to do that, and some families are not, because it's not their problem. But I think part of the difficult piece of treating the teens is the willingness to have the difficult conversation with the family and to help them understand the progression of substance use, and really that kids are watching you. And if it's going to be okay for dad or mom to use, then it's really hard to set that boundary with the child.
Even if you explain that that's an adult activity and that there
Yeah.
are lots of adult activities that you're not allowed to do, once it crosses over, it seems to me, where they wind up as somebody in a program who's been psychiatrically compromised or psychologically compromised, we have to really look at this as parents as an act of love and not just guidance.
Mm. Yeah, that act of love. I love that, and I think that that's where parents can get kind of jammed up. Like it can feel like it's punitive, or like it's some sort of punishment. And like teens say all the time, I'm here because my parents are trying to punish me. And so switching that, the narrative around that if we have a young person who's coming into treatment, and we'll have their perception as it's just pot, right? But if I have a 15-year-old who's smoking marijuana daily, that's a pretty big concern. And so having them look at it like, if your family didn't care about you, they wouldn't have intervened on you. They would have let you go down this path that is likely destructive.
Absolutely. When you do your family work, are you using certain words? And I have a prejudice about this, so let me start out. The word enabling has become really difficult for me to use, particularly with teens. So I don't use it anymore. I would love to know what your thoughts are about that word.
Yeah, I'm so glad you bring this up, because actually, there's been, at least in the family therapy that we provide, we have taken a shift from enabling. And what we've started to use is, this is a parent having a very normal response to their child being in crisis. If their child had some significant medical issue, they would do whatever they needed to do to get that person well. But then it's like with addiction, it's like, oh, well, somehow you've enabled this to continue, or you've done too much, or you haven't done enough. Parents can't win. They can't win. So what we've started to look at, instead of enabling, is we've looked at, how has this been a survival skill? How has this allowed you to tolerate it, in some cases to keep your kid alive? I think with especially some of the opioid epidemic, to say, tough love and you got to detach. For a parent who's got a young person who's using opiates, who may have already revived them with naloxone once, they can't hear it. They can't hear it.
No, no, nor would I necessarily in that moment be able to hear it. One of the lexicon I've started using instead of enabling is, you're protecting. And while you think you're protecting his future, what you're actually protecting is the disorder. You don't mean to be. It goes to the intent of the behavior, and the byproduct is the disease or the disorder or the disruption flourishes because the status quo is maintained. But protecting the the decision, the urge, the impulse is so natural.
Sure.
That's human
Sure.
nature. Yeah.
Mhm. And it's one of the ways, it's like it's a basic survival skill, right? It's this way that our species has survived all these decades, is that we want to protect and we want to survive these things.
That's right.
One of the things that we've also really taken a look at is the way that we talk with both our teens and their families about boundary setting. Because parents will often ask, what boundaries should I have in place? And I think sometimes they go to people who can't necessarily give them, they might say, well, don't let them back in your house. And the parent's like, I can't not do that. So one of the things that we've started to do is help parents to identify what are their values. What are your top 5 things that you value? And then make your boundary based off of your value, because you're much more likely to uphold it. It's much more in line with where you are as a parent, as a person. And to some degree, if it's something that you value, your kids have seen you put energy into this, or have seen, this kind of portrayed. And so they're more likely to understand where it's coming from. And again, it's more that act of love as opposed to this punitive punishment that they're experiencing.
Mm-hmm. I mean, and it is the teenager's job to test boundaries. That is the job. Every time we as parents or adults set a boundary, it's going to be tested about 64,000 times. That's the job of the kid. It's our job to hold it and just say, I value safety. It's one of my real values here. And letting you ride your bike without a helmet or go into a car with somebody I know is, not driving safely. That is consistent with my value.
Yeah, unfortunately, by the time, teenagers get into residential care, even some outpatient cares, that boundary holding, they know if they push a certain button or if they kind of skirt away around it, they're not going to have a consequence. And so when they come into treatment then, and the family's starting to set boundaries, the kid's like, been down this road, they're not going to maintain that one. So again, they're going to continue to challenge this. And so part of the coaching with the family then is to say, is this a boundary you cannot hold? And what is a natural consequence should your child choose to break it?
And one of the things I do is talk to parents about setting really small ones to start. If they start with the laundry list of boundaries, right, they're never going to be able to do it. How about talk to me with respect on the phone? And if you don't, I will hang up. That is measurable, it's maintainable, and it usually goes to the value of being respectful. That's where
absolutely. Yeah. Starting with those small boundaries, and then also you show your child that that I can maintain a boundary, and that this is what my expectation is going to be. And again, you start to rewrite the way that the family dynamic occurs.
Right. Do you encourage families and parents in particular to be honest about the difficulty of this work? I'm just curious.
I mean, I think that, some of the most impactful family therapy sessions I have seen with a child and their parent is when the parent can also take a position of vulnerability. Because really, we're modeling for our children, how to talk about emotion, how to talk about fear, how to talk about celebration and excitement and successes. And so I think if it, and not, and I understand that there's a dynamic between a parent and a child, but, and so you don't want to, lay all your cards on the table, but I think for a parent to take a position of vulnerability with their child, show that it's safe, ask for what they need. Boy, we're setting a new standard, a new way to guide conversation.
I love that. I do. Just being real people. That goes through Brene Brown's messaging and all kinds of parenting books that I've read. Be real people, right? I think we start thinking that I'm a parent now, I've got to put on my parent hat and I've got to do a parent job. And it's not really connected to the Diana job or the being of me. And it doesn't work.
Yeah. And really, I think about some of the situations that I've had even with my kids where I've had to, admit when I didn't handle things the way that I would have liked to, or where there's times where I've been short or lost my temper and I've had to go back and say like, boy, I really wish I would have handled that differently. Or, I owe you an apology. Like, you were being a 10-year-old and I was expecting you to act like a 30-year-old, right? But then, one of the things that happens is then kids learn that it's okay to admit when you've done something wrong, that forgiveness is possible, that being transparent with how you're feeling is actually celebrated and not a sign of weakness.
Yeah. And I also think that teenagers are better with conflict in some ways than the parents are. And they push us to start becoming more comfortable. But I think if we can model earlier the idea that conflict is okay, conflict is healthy, that if there are two people in the room, two opinions are really acceptable. Maybe, the way that gets addressed needs to be honed, but the fact that people don't agree is okay.
Yeah, and it's funny, it's such a great point because I do think that sometimes the teenagers, not sometimes, I would actually argue more often than not, the teenagers are okay with the conflict. Like I think about some of our girls, and again, I think women's treatment in general, again, people are either like, this is a nightmare or like they're all in. But I think about some of the difficult conversations that I have seen our teen patients have with each other that I can watch women on an adult unit not be able to have. For a teenager who's 16 to sit across from one of her peers and say, when you said that, it really hurt my feelings. Or I thought that you and this other person were talking behind my back. And so I got triggered by that. What an experience to see these 16-year-olds have these conversations. And guess what? I think the perception is, right, girls especially are going to hold on to things forever. I have seen girls have very difficult conversations with each other. And guess what? The next day, they're making bracelets next to each other in the lounge.
Yeah.
And it's because we've allowed them the space to practice the skill that you're going to need to survive life.
And all relationships.
Absolutely.
Forgiveness, honesty, authenticity, vulnerability, ownership, all of those things. Yeah, that's a great example. Mm-hmm. One of the things I have done in my history was run a girls group for a treatment program, teenagers, young adult women, all about sex. And I would come in with my Mary Poppins bag of like bracelet making and yarn and all of that. And I'd be like, come on, let's talk about sex. And they would look at me like I was some kind of freak show. And I kind of enjoyed that perception a little bit. But because of that, I think we had some incredibly rich conversations. It started out talking, I wanted to talk to them about love. It started out as a group about love. It wound up a group about sex because of the age, and in part because of what's on their mind. I think we do our young people a real disservice by assuming that's a subject we don't want to talk about.
Yeah. Yeah, and did you just hit that nail on the head, a subject we don't want to talk about, right? But, I think that the other thing that is interesting is this fear of judgment, that if I talk about sex, if I talk about sexual identity, if I talk about gender identity, then there's going to be judgment, and especially even now with some of our transgender youth and really finding their space and their people, their community, and allowing for that space to happen in therapy and especially in group therapy. Again, it's just about that relationship, that safety piece. So, our girls like to talk about sex and we talk about it with them.
Good. I love that because it's a huge part of what they're thinking about at those ages.
Oh, yeah,
there was
some of it is about
many years ago about the pie chart of the male brain, and it was 90% sex and then these other little pie chart elements.
But well, and it's so funny you bring that up because I was also thinking about how many more residentials are separated by, it's the girls and the boys together. And one of the things that I know I've struggled with over my history here has been, but when they leave here, they're going to be in group with boys. And so if we've insulated them so much that they don't know how to, be with boys in group, where they can't talk about stuff, or they need to put on a show, or they feel shut down. That was one of the things early in my career, because some of the kids were the same age as me. And so really helping to set some appropriate boundaries with them of, this is not the way that you speak to women, that this is, you have to be thoughtful about things. But I do think that's one of the areas, especially in residential care, that there's room for growth of how do you have, the genders together and help them to interact with each other in a age appropriate way.
And in that mindset, what you're talking about is the vulnerability of teens willing to be honest with one another. How rich could that conversation be between boys and girls when you say, I'm a sweater girl, or I look good in a sweater? Let me tell you what that feels like, how I hear it. That would be really rich conversation. Yeah. So, Brandy, do we have questions? I'm sorry. Erin and I got caught up.
No, but we can open the floor to the attendees to ask any questions they may have using the Q&A feature.
Awesome.
I can ask the first question. Erin, so in your experience, when do you advise parents to sort of let go and let the teens go through all these different emotions and different phases that they have to go through during those teenage years? Because it is a process, and it is a trust thing where parents have to learn, okay, she's not going to go off the rails or go, do something that she shouldn't be doing because I've raised a nice young woman or a nice young man. How do you usually advise parents for that?
That's a great question. And, one of the things I think that happens for parents is they'll have two children and they think that their boundaries or their expectations or restrictions need to be the same for both kids. And one of the things that we talk with parents a lot about is, if you have a child who maybe doesn't have a substance use or behavioral health or mental health concerns, their expectations, their boundaries might be different than the child who's struggling a little bit more, and normalizing that for parents. And also, you mentioned the word yourself, is that a lot of leeway or privilege, I guess we'll call it that, is based on trust. And so just as parents are starting to set boundaries in small ways, we advise parents, to start to give them opportunities to build trust, that it can open up then to more. One of the things our parents ask us without fail, should I give them their cell phone? First question all the time. And, one of the things that we talk about is maybe they have some structure around the cell phone to start with, or there's so many apps that you can monitor what people are doing, but cell phones are a part of life right now. And, we have some parents who they give their kids like an old school flip phone without all the smart stuff on it. And that's a place to start.
Absolutely. But I love, wow, my computer speaker is really interesting. I like what you just said about privilege is based on trust. And so working with the parents to develop the trust when they have their own trauma history, and working with the teen on, you are proving trust, so that those two parallels can match, is really valuable, I would say. Yeah. Any other questions, or?
We don't have any from the audience, and we are at about time. So I don't know if there are any closing thoughts that you may have, Erin or Diana.
No, I just think it's a great dialogue. And, one of the things I was sitting here just thinking is that part of, maybe this is my personal, I'll go with that, is that part of our job as the professional is also to create an environment for these kids that when they struggle, they want to come back. We have patients who come back because they had a good experience here. Maybe it's the safest they felt in a really long time. So I think part of that installation of hope, the building of rapport, and knowing that our door is open without judgment.
Yes. Yeah. And that, they say it in AA, they say it all over. Our job is to see them. really see them. And in that, maybe they can actually learn to accept themselves. And teenagers more so than any other client I know. All right. Thank you all for joining us for another episode of Collegial Conversations. We had Erin Goodhart, and we'll be editing this beginning of this tape, and we'll have it on our website in the next few days. So thank you all for joining. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Erin.